Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode number 8. My name is Lee. I'm in Western Australia. I'm joined this week by Zev in Melbourne
Greetings.
and Tim also in Victoria.
Yep.
And I should make note of the fact that my wife is waving like an idiot off screen, just so you know. Okay, this week we're going to be talking about two particular topics. We're going to be talking about the Howard legacy 20 years on, and we're going to talk about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, as that has sort of popped up in the news with a huge budget blowout. So this week we've had the 20th anniversary, or the last week and a half or so, the 20th anniversary of the election of the Howard government. And so we thought we'd talk about kind of the legacy of the Howard government. You know, how libertarian friendly was the Howard government? Who wants to go first?
Goodness. Well, I don't think anyone would say that the Howard government was libertarian.
Oh no, yeah, that's obvious.
I think, or classical liberal. I think it made some steps in that direction, but it was always counterbalanced by other steps in the other direction. I think if you looked at government spending, it certainly went up a great deal under the Howard government. I think that if you look at some select items of workplace reform or perhaps tax cuts, those might be regarded as positives. But I'd say it's a mixed bag at best under Howard.
I mean, really, there was... Sorry, you go, Tim.
I would say that on the whole, it was one of the better Australian governments in the fact that it's probably governed least in the fact that we didn't feel that the government, that John Howard had much of an influence in our daily lives. So it certainly, we were left alone to some extent.
He privatised health.
There were good microeconomic reforms, privatisation, tax reform, and labour market reform. But of course, as he just mentioned, they were egged on by the mining boom into giving out all this middle class welfare. So we've got all this money coming in, we've got to give it away. And of course, that was the beginning of the big spend, which was turbocharged by the next Labor government. I
mean, there's really kind of two phases of the Howard government. You've got the first two periods, so 96 to kind of 2001, and then you've kind of got like 2001 to 2007. And I think you could probably say overall the 96 to 2001 period was probably pretty good. I mean, they actually cut spending. You got Port Arthur in there and the gun control stuff, which is not so great. But, you had industrial relations reform, you actually had spending cuts, you had Telstra.
And the GST.
Qantas as well.
Yeah, Qantas. Yeah, the GST. Well, maybe we'll talk about that in a sec. Because I guess
pros and cons about the GST.
Yeah, pros and cons we'll talk about in a sec. Yeah. But we'll, and I mean, so generally I think that was pretty good. 2001 though, you bring in the war on terror. You're starting to ramp up the spending in terms of all the additional payments for sort of middle class welfare. And I think that's probably that's kind of the direction it went in. Probably the only landmark type stuff in that period is probably work choices. Like I think work choices. It's funny at the time I wasn't a libertarian when Howard finished up.
Oh, yeah.
So I hated work choices at the time. Now I look at work choices and think, man, work choices is actually pretty good. So anyway, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's better.
It was all right. Bob Day has a lot of critical things to say about work.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's probably better.
Yeah.
I dispute the view that work choices cost the Howard government in 2007. I think it was just that the Australian people thought that the government's time was up. I don't think work choices played a bigger deal in its demise as everyone says it did.
I think it played a role, but I think the other important point to make there is that the Howard government didn't really fight back, to coin a phrase, to kind of call back on a phrase, really. It didn't really explain why work choices was good. It said, when their campaign, as far as I remember, was like, "Oh, work choices, you still keep all of your entitlements. Don't worry, nothing has changed."
It's like we're not screwing you over too much. That's basically
exactly.
what they. And of course, Kevin Andrews was the workplace minister at the time. Could you pick a worse spokesperson?
Well, yeah. I mean, having said that, though, I mean, I think workplace reform is always going to be hard in Australia, just because.
But he got the first part of workplace reforms done in '96, so he'd done it before.
Yeah, and really, I mean, like a lot of this was just a continuation of the stuff under Labor as well, from what I understand. So it's not like this is all of a sudden some radical change from Labor. It was really just kind of the final stage of what began under Keating. But I mean, I think it's people's attitude towards workplace like Labor regulation is very particular in Australia, and I think there's a lot of kind of really a lot of attitudes that are really not conducive towards free market reform. Like, I think it's very people essentially want the government to regulate very heavily, so it's always going to be an uphill battle.
And there's a lot of crusted on interest groups that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that was a huge boon for the labours for the unions, because they essentially exist to be a parasite in the existing system.
And plus, there's a lot of dislike for big business as well.
Yeah.
And for anything that seems to favor big business is automatically resented somewhat.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about. Okay, let's talk about. I mean, we don't know if we've really talked about gun control a whole lot, but let's talk about Port Arthur, because that's probably the first major political event in the Howard government. So, for those who are unaware, there was Martin Bryant was a deeply disturbed man who went into Port Arthur in Tasmania and shot 35 people. It's actually probably one of the largest
dead.
Yeah, shot dead. Yeah, 35 people. So it was one of the most horrific gun massacres in all of the world, almost. And it led to quite a substantial amount of gun regulation as a result.
Throughout Australia, really.
Yeah, throughout Australia. So I mean, it led to essentially like a national firearms. Essentially,
not laws, but like a national firearms agreement, which led to the implement of national laws on a state. Throughout the
and
state.
there was a gun buyback scheme as well, where thousands of weapons were brought back and destroyed.
Yeah, well, some of those ended up just disappearing as well. So I guess it's a good example of how any sort of government regulation doesn't always work. But I mean, like, essentially, it more or less eliminated the use of semi-automatic rifles and guns and shotguns, pretty much across the board. Like, almost hardly anybody can get them now. I mean, is there any? I mean, the thing for me is it took away the being able to buy a gun for the purpose of self-defense. Like, I think that's probably the biggest change. I mean, restricting types of guns, okay, that's not great, but for me, the key thing that really sinks this is anything remotely coming close to some sort of limited government view. Like, the thing that really undermines sort of its position is essentially the lack of being able to buy a gun for self-defense. So,
and it also really successfully in the end crushed sort of the firearms shooters sort of culture in Australia somewhat. I mean, because it was brought in by a conservative government, the fact that it seemed to be bipartisan really sort of made it so that the firearms sort of subsection didn't have a voice anymore.
Which brought about some of the minor parties that we see today, like the Shooters and Fishers and the Liberal Democrats, I suppose. Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, like, essentially, they're the only political parties that have any sort of remotely gun-friendly view of government. You know, like, it's everybody else are just hardcore gun controllers. And even the supposedly arch-conservative government of Tony Abbott, like, they did all this stuff with the Adler shotgun. You know, it seems even the hardcore right don't have any interest in defending the rights of gun owners.
Well, and it's also an example of like how introducing this law is introducing a law that made us all feel safer, but didn't actually make us any safer, really.
That's it, yeah.
And I think another interesting thing is that in the shooters community, the reaction, I think what appears to have been perhaps there was some debate at the time. I mean, I was very young, so I don't know. But the reaction nowadays seems to be very much one of total denial in some cases. That, you know, it wasn't mutton at all. It was, you know, the government agent on the grassy knoll, so to speak.
Right.
You know?
Wow.
So it seems to be very sad in some ways that so many people just can't deal with the fact that people can use firearms for ill and can't just, well, address that and say, yes, they can be used for ill, but they can also be used for beneficial purposes.
That's it.
So I it's interesting just to see that. Anyway.
And it's worth pointing out, I mean, this is what Howard did after Port Arthur is what all the liberal, you know, the lefties in the US point to, like the gun buybacks and all the whatnot. They point back to Howard and say, well, you know, they bought up all the guns and they haven't had any mass shootings, ignoring the fact that we actually have.
We've had plenty of shootings. Miraculously, not enough people have died for them to be classified mass shootings. And
well, no, there actually has been. So Monash shooting in 2011?
How many people died?
I think it's 4 or 5. 2000, yeah.
2000.
So there's been one, and then there's been another number of instances where, I mean, I guess we've had just today. They had the Ingleburn shooting, and then you had the Sydney siege a couple of years ago. So, you know, it's not. I guess it's one of those things.
There's still shootings going on, but at least, you know, only a few people are dying in them as opposed to a few more. I mean, that's basically what
which
gun
is
controllers would say.
Yeah, and that's always been the case in Australia. Like, Australia has never been a particularly violent place. It's never been a great number of mass shootings. There was a 30-year period under the previous laws where nothing happened. I mean, there was no mass shootings. New Zealand, they haven't changed their gun laws since 96. I think they had a pretty similar regime to what we used to have. And they haven't had any. So it's one of those things, I guess. It's there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of... just posturing, you know. It's the nature of politics. Well, let's talk about go.
Yeah, one thing that, while we're talking about non-economic issues, I think one of the things that should be pointed out about how government is that it really put a stop to political correctness that was emerging in the early 90s in terms of...
In what sense?
You know, well, in terms of rejecting the black armband view of history, I mean, Keating was very much, you know, for, you know, more multiculturalism, more reconciliation, and Howard saw that there was sort of a resentment of the emerging political correctness, and so he sort of saw his role as Prime Minister to sort of, you know, make Australians more proud of their country and their culture, and so I think that's probably one of the biggest changes he made in making us sort of a more nationalistic country and sort of, you know,
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a double-sided thing because on one hand, okay, maybe that is a good thing, but then you get the whole boat refugee issue, and the whole boat refugee issue has been permanently stained with this nationalistic attitude, which is not. I don't think it's neither good nor. I don't think it's particularly libertarian either.
I'm just pointing out that this is something that is the legacy of the Howard government, that it certainly led to a more, I'd say, nationalistic view of Australia, which I think still is present today. I mean, big Australia Day is Anzac Day, and so I think it's important to point that out, that sort of Howard fostered that in his time.
Yeah, and some of that would be a response to Pauline Hanson. So those who are not from Australia, Pauline Hanson was an incredibly, she's a out and out racist, but basically under a guise of kind of nationalism, spoke out against Asian immigration, which is kind of laughable now in the current political climate. I mean, this is back in '98. To talk about Asian immigration being the great scourge of Australia is like hilarious in view of the fact that we've got practically millions of Asian students coming to Australia every year, and we welcome them.
Yeah. Oh my God, those Chinese restaurants, God, they're so threatening.
Yeah. So I mean, that's One Nation was the political party that started in '98 under by this woman Pauline Hanson, who was Well, she fortunately didn't last long in politics. Unfortunately, she's always lurked around because racists need their figureheads. Let's talk about the GST. So the big change in after the 98 election was the introduction of a goods and services tax. The controversy of this was that Howard essentially ruled it out, as his predecessor, the former leader of the Liberal Party, had John Hewson. Their main one of their big economic reforms was a goods and services tax. So basically, he had to go back on his own word in the space of a single election or electoral
he
period.
said he would introduce it in that term of government. I think that.
Yeah, it wasn't a broken promise. That was just a change of opinion that he put to the people. So it wasn't one of those awful.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if people saw it that way. Even if
Howard did
technically
say
wasn't.
that if you like the GST, you'll vote for me. If you don't like it, you won't vote for me. So
Well,
it was pretty direct.
Yeah, I mean that's. Like, I think that is at least like a very credible position to take, and a fair one, I think. What are people's thoughts about? The GST's now been around for 16 years. Has it led to genuine change? Is it still Has it led to because the goal was to actually eliminate a whole bunch of state taxes in favour of a GST.
It did do that.
Not
Go on.
Not all of them though,
Yes,
because it was originally hoped that states would get rid of stamp duty and payroll taxes, and what's the other one, land tax as well, but we've still got those. So we didn't. So it didn't quite achieve everything it set out to. But yeah, I'm certainly of the view that sales tax are the least economically damaging taxes. So
Although,
I
of
don't
course,
have.
Yeah. Although I think
I don't
ironically or perversely, some libertarians argue that because they're so easy to collect, we should fear them and not allow them to be levied at all. We should use other less efficient means of collection because that's just too easy an revenue source for government. Which I've always found.
That's the old argument that we need to make sure that governments look as evil as they are. Right.
I've always found that, to be honest, a bit of a strange argument. But look, I don't know if the GST brought in a change for the better. I think it's impossible to say. Particularly, I do think at least on the upside, maybe there were people in the state revenue offices that were let go and had to take up productive careers because they no longer had to levy the taxes that they had to before. Maybe that's a good thing. And maybe money was saved in collecting taxes, and maybe that's a good thing too. But we don't really know, I think.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's certainly changed the politics of the federation.
Made it much harder to raise one specific tax, which is the GST.
Which is a good thing, yeah.
That's a good thing,
yeah,
I guess.
And eliminating the complexity of the sales tax system there was, because essentially you had different categories of goods that had attracted different levels of taxation, and it was a bit of a dog's breakfast from what I remember. So that's a good thing. I think the bad side is I think it reinforced fiscal sort of vertical fiscal integration. Is that the phrase? Essentially centralizing taxation within the federal government instead of leaving it in the hands of the states. And I think that's essentially the key, probably the single greatest political issue right now.
I mean, if the states really wanted to, if you think about it, the states could have just levied their own GSTs.
Well, yes,
and scrapped the taxes that they imposed.
Yeah.
This wasn't like this agreement in the end. It wasn't particularly. I don't think Howard can be completely blamed for that. It's just that the trends in Australian history is just more and more power to the federal government, and so.
And I mean, essentially, it's
but not in all.
It's a system to continue subsidising states that really need to lift their game. So, essentially, Tasmania and South Australia.
That's a problem with the distribution, not with the actual GST itself.
Well, yeah, but if you have redistribution of taxation is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Like, it means that some state governments can get away with crappy policies because the other states are subsidizing them, and I don't think that's a good idea. So I mean, that's a separate issue from the centralization question. But I think it's still a big problem that continues to
haunt our dreams to this day.
Yeah. So I mean,
I know I wake up and I think to myself, "Gosh, that allocation has to." But in all seriousness, I agree. Yeah.
All right.
That's certainly the Western Australian coming out.
Well, I mean, yeah. See,
he's right. Lee's right, and the Western Australians are right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this highlights it because essentially Colin Barnett should be cutting spending, but he isn't. He's using the distribution of the GST as an excuse to do nothing, and I think it's an appalling. I don't understand why. Yeah. Free market conservatives within Western Australia, I mean, apart from the partisan thing, like I just don't understand why people would support Barnett in that particular take on the issue. But anyway, we need to quickly talk about the war on terror because quickly talk about a massive issue. But let's talk about the war on terror because that's probably the other major aspect of the Howard government that we need to sort of discuss. That, 9/11 happened and it changed everything. Like in the US, in Australia, it led to a massive upsurge in anti-terrorism legislation and just general focus on national security.
Growth in all the national security agencies. I mean, you've got so many with so much money.
Pointless waits in the airport. There's a big growth in pointless waits at the airport and tokenistic security measures and wastes of our time and money. Big growth in that and big growth in bureaucracy too. Yeah. Sorry.
But the Howard anti-terror laws look, well, compared to what we've got now, they look much better, or at least bad.
Compared to what we've got now. Yeah, well, look, I mean, they were a bad start and things have gotten worse. And they went in the same tradition as the Howard laws did in the first place. So I think it was very much a product of gesture politics. I think as convinced as that they were doing something good, I don't think they were doing anything good at all by introducing them. But I do think they believed that they were doing something to save us. I really think they believed it. I don't think they were being cynical, but I also think they were being totally misguided.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a real politic kind of look at the issue, I think it's almost inevitable that something would change because you had not only did you have 9/11, but you also had the Bali bombs, and 88 Australians were killed in the Bali bombs. So it's really, really very much the case that I don't think just maintaining the status quo was ever going to be a realistic political option. I mean, I think really, if Howard had said no, actually, I think our anti-terrorism stuff is okay, Labor would have come up with the war hawk hat on, and they just would have forced them to change it. So I think that the key thing is actually now just
governments always have to be seen to do something.
Yes, that's part of the problem. I think that they have to be seen to do something about the issues of the day, and people look to them to solve the issues of the day. When really they can't solve most of them.
No. I mean, I think that the key thing is to try and, now that these things are sort of, like the issue is losing a bit of steam and we're finding out that actually, no, we're not as at risk as people might have thought they were. Now the case is on libertarians to say, well, actually, we need to wind this back. It's expensive. It's it's expensive and wasteful. There's all these people involved in all this stuff they don't need to be, and it's also dangerous to.
And it's sorry, go on.
I was going to say it's dangerous to democracy. Having the endless expanse of the police state or the military industrial complex or whatever you want to call it, like that's not healthy for civil liberties.
I think another indelible mark that Howard put on our debate was the boats debate, the refugee debate, which he very much handled in a restrictive manner as a way of cutting down refugee numbers in Australia. And
he didn't actually cut the actual numbers down. I mean, it was still the same amount of refugees accepted every year.
Right. What I'm getting at, though, is that in that broader debate about whether to take more or less, Howard took the view that there should be fewer. And it's interesting because you would have thought that having followed on from the Labor government, which introduced detention centres, he would have perhaps taken a more liberal view, so to speak, of how migration policy in this country should work. And he perhaps could have made an argument that, all right, asylum seekers or migrants or what have you should all be treated alike and should to a greater degree be allowed to come here because they're all contributing very nicely. And to some extent he did that or rather, to some extent he did encourage migration because he encouraged some degree of skilled migration, at least.
Yes.
But he didn't address the refugee question. In fact, he embraced Labor's take on the refugee question back when they introduced detention centres and went with it as far as he could go. So it's interesting that that could be regarded as one of his few not few perhaps, but one of his anti-market activities that really put a mark on Australian politics and really seems to characterise what's called the right today, but it's a very stridently anti-market position.
Well, look, everyone knows that I'm not a bleeding heart on immigration, and so obviously, like I look at what's happening in Europe at the moment and what happened when Labor relaxed their immigration laws, and we saw just people coming in and they don't have many skills, and so most of the time it's the government that have to support them. And so I think if we have the immigration system as it is, then I think border control is needed.
All right, but that's a bit of a question about whether we should have the system as it is. I mean, that just brings into that goes into that whole debate that we should be having. I mean, should we be having welfare for refugees at all? Should we be having a limit on the number of places for people who come into Australia? What if we couple those issues together and tell people, well, we don't have to pay other people's money, taxpayer money towards it, but if they want to come and get a job, why not? And why do we even need to ask them if they're refugees or not? Who cares? Let them come and work and contribute. And that's a classical liberal argument.
Yeah, I think probably the bigger issue from just kind of an overall liberty perspective is essentially the nationalist kind of rhetoric around it and the portraying these people as a threat to Australians. I mean, I guess you can debate about what is the best policy for managing refugees, but I think if you want to have a culture of liberty, like we're going beyond just the specific policy details, if you want a freedom-loving people, then viewing brown people as the enemy coming in on boats I don't think that's sort of conducive towards that end. So,
but Howard he wasn't anti-immigrant. I mean, we just said before he allowed a lot of skilled migration in. So that's just
but I mean, essentially he turned refugee policy into a national security issue, and I think that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't think it needs to be in that area. And really, the end result of that is this, border farce and all the rest of all the stuff that's gone under Abbott.
Yes, and the idea that the border force should get these fancy uniforms and medals and firearms.
But also, like, I mean,
bureaucrats. It's ridiculous.
Like making the military the ones in charge of this whole issue, which it's not a military issue. And like all the legislations that's got journalists out of the overseas detention centers and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's all as a result of making refugee policy a national security issue, because then they can bring in the military and make it under martial law, essentially, because it's not a civilian issue dealt with by just sort of treating people sort of civilly. It's now, we need multi-million-dollar warships going out and detaining these people. And that's
$1 billion detention camps and so
Yeah.
well, detention camps.
I just think the alternative that we've seen happen in our own country and in Europe is much worse. So, of course, the current system has these excesses, but I think on the other side of the coin, that is much worse.
Well, okay. We'll let you have the final word on that. We actually ran out of time to talk about the NDIS, so we'll have to talk about it next week. Well, I guess, Howard was in power for, what was it, 11 years?
11 and a half years.
Yeah, so, it's a lot of stuff that went on. So, and I mean, I think all of us can agree that at least Howard had a mixed bag, unlike the clowns that have come since then. So,
which have been
overall,
I would
pretty much.
Yeah, I would have him back in a heartbeat. I would.
Yeah, I'm almost at the point where I'd agree. All right, well that leaves us for episode 8 of Taking Liberties. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.
Good night.
See ya.